To get started on this exercise, you should have downloaded the Fruit Painting folder, and inside of this folder I have 3 different images that you can pick and choose from. You're only required to do one of these images for this exercise, so whichever one you choose, that's okay. Also inside of this folder, I've got a variety of different brushes that you could load up later on within the project. We'll talk about that after a little while. Next, let's fire up Adobe Illustrator. Let's go up to File and create a new document. Now the size of this document needs to be a regular letter size piece of paper. So we're going to set the width to be 8.5 and the height to be 11, and make sure you're working in inches. So 8.5 by 11 inches. We only need one artboard, no bleed, but under your color settings, do make sure you have RGB as your color mode. If it gives you a warning off to the side, it's safe to ignore that. From here, we'll keep everything else at the default, and we'll say create and work through our new document. Now for this exercise, make sure you have access to your layers panel, your brushes panel, and also your color panel for color picking. Later on, we may play around with some of the other panels, but for the most part, those are the 3 that we need. The first thing you need to do is to place one of the JPEGs into your layers as a template. So let's go up to File, down to Place, and let's locate those fruit photographs. There they are. For this exercise, I'm going to be working through the pair, but remember, you can choose any of the other 2 that you want. Before we place it, make sure to open up your options and select Template as the option to import this as. With Template selected, when you place it, this is going to put your pair on its own separate layer. It's going to dim it down just a bit, and it's also going to lock it, making this perfect to be able to trace. However, once it places, it may be slightly off center, and let's make it a little bit smaller. So on our layers panel, I'm going to unlock this layer. Hold down Shift as you click on the edge, and this will scale it down and keep everything nice and proportional. Just make it big enough so that it fits inside of the page that you're working on. Also, I don't want to dim it down. I want to see the true colors that are below it. So back on the layers panel, double click on the layer icon. This will bring up the layer options, and let's uncheck dim to bring it back up to 100%. Now we can return to our layers panel and lock down that layer, and all the initial work we're going to work on will be on layer number 1. Now there are a variety of different ways of doing any kind of vector illustration, and so this is only one technique. I like using this technique and teaching this technique because it's a good blend of different ways of doing Illustrator and vector drawings. So you can pick and choose different parts of this whenever you apply this to your own projects in your own artwork. But to get started, we're going to be working with our pencil tool first. To locate the pencil tool, remember it's found underneath your shaper tool if you don't see it nested in your tools. With the pencil tool selected, let's go ahead and double click on the icon and open up the tool options. With these tool options, you can play around with the fidelity, but I'm going to keep it towards the middle for now. We're going to keep the Fill New Pencil Strokes unchecked for now, but we do want to keep it selected, and we also want to be able to close off the path and edit the path whenever we come close to the ending of it. So keep both of those checked on. From here, we can say OK. Alright, so here's the technique that we want to do to draw off the base of our pear. I'm going to be looking for any area of shapes that have the same color and relatively the same value. Now we don't want to go too large of an area because it'll start picking up on 2 different changes, and we don't want to have too many small areas because it may be way too much. But if I was to look at this pear, let's say I had some nice area like right here. All of that's relatively the same value and same color. So all I did was just draw off a basic little shape to outline that area. With that done, choose your eyedropper tool and click in the middle of it, and you can see how it fills it in with that local color that you clicked on. Next, I can swap back over to my pencil tool, and let's go back in and draw off another shape. To do this, I also need to deselect my object. So I'm going to hold down Command and just click away from it. That way it deselects it. Also, I'm going to swap my fill and stroke color. So to do this quickly, I can either click on the arrow, or I can hold down Shift X and it will swap for me as well. So you're going to see me use Shift X as the keyboard shortcut. Then go back up and let's fill in another basic shape. So here's one right here. Now notice when I did this shape that I overlapped both of those shapes. It's okay to do some overlapping. Actually, it'll look better if you have a little bit of overlapping. Next, go back, grab your eyedropper tool, click in the middle of that, and now you can see you've got a different shape and a slightly different value on top of this. Grab your pencil tool again, and let's go back in, deselect it. I'm going to hold down Command and click away, and let's choose another shape. Click and drag over. Now if you get off on the shape of the pear, that's okay, because later on we're going to go back in and colorize the whole thing. But repeating this process back and forth. By the way, the keyboard shortcuts for the eyedropper tool is the I on your keyboard, and the keyboard shortcut for the pencil tool is N on your keyboard. So if you need to just hit I and N going back and forth, you can do that. Holding down Command and clicking away. And I can press N to get my pencil, Shift X to swap up the colors, and going back in. And let's do another line here. So real quickly, you can see this is a shape. Swapping over to I, picking up that local color, and getting that color placed in there as well. So by the end of this, we're going to have like a patchwork quilt of whatever fruit that you've selected. Again, don't get too large with these areas, but also don't get too small with it. But this will be a good basic outline for the entire area. Alright, now that we've roughed in the fill color of all of our area, we can start to use our brush tool to paint in some of the smaller details and make it look a little bit more painterly. In order to do this, I'm going to create a new layer on top of this layer. We'll lock down layer 1, make a new layer, and this layer is where we're going to add our details to it. Also, I need to be able to see where I'm working, so I'm going to unlock my template for now, choose my Move tool, and let's drag our picture off to the side so I can see both it and my painted area. Now when I do this, you can see there are some areas that didn't overlap and have a few gaps. If that happens to you, that's okay. We're going to go in and we'll fix those and clean up the entire thing in just a second. Once it's moved over, let's lock down our template layer. Let's return now to layer 3. If you want to be able to fix any areas that you see have little holes, all you need to do is grab your pencil tool one more time. We'll draw off an area, just real small of a patch. Then choose your eyedropper tool and fill it in with whatever color that you think would be most appropriate for that area. So take some time now and fill in any small holes that you may see. Alright, with that out of the way, now let's focus on using our paintbrush. Going over to our Tools panel, locate your paintbrush icon and double click on it to open up the paintbrush tool options. As with the pencil, you can play around with your fidelity, whether you want smooth or accurate lines, but I'm going to keep mine towards the middle. We can also uncheck filling new brush strokes and keeping it selected, and we'll say OK to this. This way whatever we paint will just be solid lines. Next, go over to your brushes panel. Now I'm going to let you pick and choose whatever brush that you want to work in, as long as it's appropriate for the painting that you're creating. So an appropriate brush would be something that has kind of a traditional painting or drawing type media. We wouldn't want to use like a repeating pattern or any of these artistic kind of brushes. The bristle brushes tend to work out really well in some of these artistic brushes. Also, your stippling or scatter brushes are really good. I've even seen some really good ones using calligraphic brushes, although these can be a little bit difficult to get to look very natural or very artistic. If you want to add on more brushes and have more options to pick and choose from, go down to the little library at the bottom left-hand corner of your brushes panel. This will give you a submenu, and from here you can see there's a variety of different brushes you can try to play around with. I like the artistic brushes. With these selected, you've got a variety of different styles. There's even one for watercolor. Now when you open these up, these will be opened in their own separate panel, and you can expand the panel and you can see all the different brushes to pick and choose from here. Now if you want, you can find other brushes online like the ones that I gave you, and you can add those brushes into your panel as well and play around with those. If you want to add those, go to your brushes library at the very bottom, then choose Other Library, and this will ask you to find that brush library. Let's locate the one that I gave to you. It's found in the fruit painting folder, and some of the other ones are like this one is a stippled brush. When I say open, as with the others, it's going to open in its own panel, and here's the stippled brushes up here at the top. Whichever brushes you decide to choose, make sure you play around with them to get the appropriate settings. So for instance, if I wanted to use one of these stipple brushes, I'm going to select it. You can see it automatically adds to my brush panel. When I click and drag, you can see what the brush looks like. Now these lines that I've created are 1 point in stroke, or 100%, and also 100% opacity. Another way of blending brushes is by changing up their blending mode and within their transparency panel. I'm going to swap over to these watercolor brushes. If I was to choose one of these watercolors and start to paint with it, you can see it gives me some nice strokes to paint with, and they have a nice lower opacity. Now I can select these and I can change out the thickness of them, making them thicker, and I can go up to the opacity and I can even drop them down even farther. So if I wanted to or needed to be able to lighten up or slowly, gradually bring up the lightness of it, that's one way of working with this. Now when I start to paint on top of my area, let's say I chose this and started to paint it, you can see how very quickly it's starting to blend in all of those strokes. Now with them selected, I was working at 44% opacity. I can click on the word opacity to open up my transparency panel, and I can even start to play around with their blending mode. So if I needed to make it darker, I could choose something like multiply. It's really, really light, so you're not going to see too much of it. But if I needed to make it lighter, I can even go up to screen, and I can screen in that one as well. So sometimes, depending on the brush that you're using, you'll want to change the blending mode to work with this. For me, I'm going to use these watercolor brushes just as a starting point. What I want to do is look at any areas that I think I want to clean up. For instance, this highlight needs to be a little bit lighter. Maybe I can add some directional strokes and be able to clean up the edges and look and feel of my overall pear. The final thing I'll say about this is it's okay to go outside the edges. Later on we'll do a final cleanup to really make this look like it's a good crisp edge with it. So with that, I'm going to select this as my paintbrush just for now, and let's test it out. I'm going to eyeball the color. Let's see, we'll do it kind of a green. And if I paint on top of it, I can see it's giving me this kind of area. I want to lighten up this area, but I don't want it to look like that. So I'm going to hold down Command and select that brush stroke that I created. Let's go up to our opacity and play around with the blending mode till I get something that I like. Changing the blending mode from multiply is going to make it darker, so it's not necessarily what I want. If I do screen, I think that's a bit too much. And if I did overlay, it is somewhere in between, and I kind of like that. Also, I can still drop my opacity down if I think it's a bit too strong for any of those. So if I drop it down, that gives me something that looks a little bit better like that. With that done, now if I paint several strokes on top of it, this just gives me a basic idea of what this would look like with a few paint strokes. Now we don't want to do too many, I just want to get an idea of the paint strokes. In this case, these are a little bit too light, so I'm holding down Command and I'm selecting both of those. Let's go back up to our opacity and let's change it over to multiply. And this way these areas down here can get a little bit darker. So I only want to give an indication that it's getting darker down here. You can also change up the color that you're working with. So in this case, maybe it's getting a little bit darker, and then we'll swap over to a thinner paintbrush. You can even vary up the style of brushes that you're working in. The main thing is I'm letting those base colors still show through. I'm also eyeballing the colors that I'm picking, so I'm not having to pick directly from the painting that I have. This way I can make my colors darker, lighter, give a little bit of variation to their final design. Remember, if you go outside the edge, that's okay, because later on we're going to go back in and we're going to clean up those edges as well. I like the texture of this one. Maybe I'll drop the opacity down. Lowering the opacity allows you to blend between two different colors. If you lower it too much, you can't see the stroke that you're making. Now I'll go back in and add in that highlight just a little bit more. Now if I add the highlight now, it's not going to show up. That's because my blending mode is set to multiply. I want my blending mode to be either overlay or screen. I'm going to choose overlay. Let's add back in that highlight area. Again, play around with the settings. If I thought that was too thick, let's go in with a thinner stroke and add in that as well. Let's do a little bit of a highlight that goes along this edge. I want it to look painterly. I want to see the direction of the strokes. I want to see a couple of strokes to be done. Now if you do too many strokes, it's going to look a little bit overworked. So I'm being very careful and very mindful not to have too much within this area. We'll also go up and do the stem. Don't want to forget about that. Since I need it to be darker on one side, I'm going to swap my opacity over to multiply. And get several of those in with there. The last thing I'll do is maybe I'll use a different brush to add some other textures. I used that stipple brush earlier, so I'm going to select it. Again, grab my paintbrush tool, and I'm going to set my color mode to overlay. I'm going to bring my opacity up to 100%. And let's again choose that stipple brush. With the stipple brush selected, it'll give me those. Let's add in some little dots of color on top of there. Changing up the size of my brush if I think it needs to be slightly larger. That looks pretty good with that. And also I want to change up the color that I'm working in. Let's make it a little bit darker. I like that. So feel free to use a variety of brushes, but also a variety of blending modes within these brushes. It does take just a little bit of practice to get used to, but once you get that, you'll start to get some really nice results. I want it to look painterly, and I don't want it to look too overworked. The last thing that we need to do is to clean up the outer edge of our painting. To do that, we need to flatten all of our artwork that we have. Let's go to our Layers panel, click on the Layer options, and choose Flatten Artwork. This is going to take all of your layers and turn it down into one solid layer. With that done, let's go back over to our picture side and grab your pencil tool. With the pencil tool selected, and let's go to the very bottom of your toolbox and let's reset all this back to the default settings. To do that, click on the little default fill and stroke icon located at the bottom left corner between your fill and stroke. This will reset everything back to black and white, and also it'll get rid of your scatter brush that you were working with as well. So I'm going to zoom in on my pear, and we want to be able to carefully trace the outline of the pear, being as accurate as possible. Now when I do this, I'm going to click and drag very slowly, trace it off. I can hold down my space bar and it gives me my little hand, and I can click and drag with that. And because I stopped my line, but now I can bring it closer to that edge and start again. So very carefully going along the edge, but because we turned on keep selected and also edit within, you should be able to draw that. Now if it's off by a little bit, that's okay. But we want to be able to cover up the entire area of the pear. There. Once you reach the end, it'll also close it off. Now we can do Command 0 and that will back out. Now that we've got an outline, we're going to quickly fill it in by clicking on the little swap fill and stroke. This should give you a black area on the outside. What we want to do is to take this new object and place it right on top of the pear that we've drawn. So it should mask on top of it that way. Do be careful to try to align it as best as possible to the outline that you have for your pear. And if you need to, you can use your arrow keys to nudge it into place. With that done, we can now erase away our reference photo by clicking it and deleting it away. Then, in order to create a mask from this area, we're going to select everything that's on the artboard. So I can use my black arrow selection tool to click and drag over it. And with everything selected, go up to Object, down to Clipping Mask, and choose Make. Because that black was on top of our drawn area, this will mask out all of the parts that are underneath it. With that done, now you can see it has nice clean edges and nothing spattered off to the edge. From here, if you wanted to add any other details, you can always go back in with your paintbrush tool and paint inside of it. You can even add a drop shadow or a cast shadow if you want, but I'm not going to require it for this particular exercise. Once you're finished with this, we need to upload the Adobe Illustrator file. So let's go to File and Save. Do make sure to add your name to it. Oops. The format we're going to be saving this as is of Adobe Illustrator. We'll say Save. And with the options, we'll keep it at the default options. We'll say OK to that. Once it finishes saving, upload this Illustrator file to Moodle, or if it's too large, you can email it directly to Mr. Ivey.